Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us from. My name is Caroline Gadi. I'll be the moderator for today's session. My co-moderator is Sarah Adamoka. Thank you for joining us and would like to welcome you to this discussion. This discussion series is themed Accelerating Efforts to Build SME Resilience to Disasters in Africa. We recognize the presence of our partners and we will start with recognizing our keynote speaker, Margareta Wallston. She's the president of the Swedish Red Cross. We recognize the presence of Michael Vincent, a consultant in business continuity management. We recognize our panelists, Joseph Kuria, Imran Tariq, Mary Ngesho, Muthoni Njogu. And we also recognize the presence of the members of the public sector present. We recognize the members of the private sector present. We recognize the members of the development partners present, NGOs, and everybody present here, including members of Invest in Africa. I would like to introduce our country manager, Wangeshi Muriuki. Wangeshi Muriuki is a country manager of Invest in Africa in Kenya, and she will give her introductory remarks on this session and the reason that we are hosting them. Wangeshi?
So thank you much, Caroline. And on behalf of Invest in Africa, my name is Wangeshi. I am the country manager, as Caroline had put it. And I would like to welcome you all as we kick off our dialogue series. We are conducting this in partnership with the MasterCard Foundation. So Invest in Africa is a leading and accelerator that is working in Africa with the vision of prospering African economies. Our objective is to drive sustainable growth and job creation. All we think about is how can we create jobs, and therefore we are trying to solve all those systemic issues around the ecosystem in order to drive more and more job creation through our work. So we coordinate efforts of our private sector in order to drive greater investment through partnerships, and also with a very clear mission of enabling trade between SMEs, or small and medium enterprises, and the larger organizations. So we do this by improving access to markets, access to skills, and finance in the key sectors that have high impact for job creation, like infrastructure. We've worked in oil and gas, extractives, in mining. We work across food and agriculture, and we focus on embedding youth and gender inclusivity across our work for sustainable growth. And as a growth catalyst for SMEs in Africa, IIA has created a support ecosystem for small and medium enterprises. So we run this high impact network that includes multinationals. We work with corporate buyers. We work with development finance institutions. We have international development partners. We work with banks. We have impact investors across our network. And all of these share one common purpose: to empower enterprise and to create jobs. So we deliver this mission by enabling trade through a digital platform, which our members are a part of. It is called biashara.now. And on this platform, we have registered over 5,000 SMEs who are our members that are pre-vetted, they are registered, and they are validated. So this is the marketplace that we've been working to develop across the years when we have been operating. And our SME members have been linked to opportunities in financing provided by Invest in Africa's partners to the tune of about $5.5 million, and contributing to over 80,000 new jobs out of these market opportunities and linkages through our partners who provide contracts to SMEs on the platform. So we are here today because we are laser focused on small and medium enterprises. They matter to us, and I don't want to go into discussing the importance of SMEs because we are all aware about their significant contributions to Africa's economy. From an employment perspective, we know that they employ millions of people, they create new jobs, they are a large constituent in terms of numbers as producers, as suppliers of products, and they are an important component in key value chains today. And so we can't ignore them. And everybody is talking about the coronavirus pandemic, which of course has been a major disruptor to the world economy. And ecosystem actors like Invest in Africa, from the public and private sector, have all responded with timely interventions to support SMEs in coping with the shock. And for us as Invest in Africa, we responded really early by developing survival toolkit for SMEs right in the month of April, in early April, and we started delivering virtual programs through webinars, through masterclasses, where we have been able to reach and train over 2,000 SMEs. These have been engaged through training under our resilience and recovery series that is delivered in partnership with Mastercard. So we started reaching out to partners way back to talk about the impacts of COVID on SMEs. And while we recognize the huge efforts and initiatives by both private and the public sector actors in order to cushion SMEs and support recovery, we realize that most of the efforts really are concerned about the week to week, day by day, short term survival and recovery. And like I said, we also developed this toolkit that had tools, how to guides, best practice for the SMEs to help them focus on the short term immediate impacts on recovery, but not really the long term sustainability of SMEs. And then in July, we further on conducted a survey to investigate and understand the impacts of COVID-19 on our membership at Invest in Africa. And this focused on those that have registered on our platform. We conducted this study between July and August this year. Now, upon receiving and looking at the survey findings, we started noticing some crippling effects of the pandemic, and we realized how vulnerable our SMEs really are. You know, we've been here creating this ecosystem, delivering interventions, training, the survival toolkit, but our findings did reveal that already 28% of our SMEs had come to a grinding halt by July, and 50% had unpaid bills as suppliers. So half of them had supplied and not been paid. And another 13% had job losses within their companies. And not forgetting also that several families have had their lives changed forever. So this disturbed us as Invest in Africa. And we started thinking and rethinking as we reflected more and more about those findings, because we realized that despite the heightened attention on COVID-19 impacts, our study also showed that there were other risk factors that we were not paying attention to, and we didn't hear anybody talk about. For instance, the locust menace of East Africa, which we all know about, the flooding, the climate change, prolonged drought, amongst others that had severely affected SMEs if the setting in of it. Our study also revealed that SMEs have inadequate disaster risk information. So we started thinking and looking at this from a disaster perspective while we were really firmly focused on COVID-19, which is also one of the disasters. So for example, the floods have really affected some of our SMEs operating in areas the northern Kenya, like Turkana, with roads disrupting access to materials, supplies, the locusts have destroyed farms, and here we are focusing in agribusiness. And so the more we reflected on this, the more our understanding and awakening of the urgency to accelerate these efforts towards building the resilience of SMEs from a risk perspective and a disaster perspective began to grow. As we just thought about it, we started getting this sense of urgency around our work. And so, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm saying today is that those findings have prompted us to think and reflect carefully about how we can support SMEs strategically and not just think about now, and about making sure that we push in a direction of more resilient SMEs that can withstand disruptions in the future. There are other impending and looming disasters besides COVID-19. So we started to deeply reflect, how prepared are these SMEs? We've created a platform, we do have nice programs, we have a survival toolkit, but are our SMEs really prepared for the future? So this was the point when we realized that convening the ecosystems while pooling resources that we have amongst ourselves is a sure way to addressing sustainability of the resilience interventions. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, this really calls on us to address SME risk from that holistic perspective of understanding disaster risk. What is this? In all its dimensions, we are really talking about the vulnerability of SMEs, but are they aware of disaster risk? Do we have policy framework? Do we have programs to strengthen them to withstand the future shocks? And then as we reflected on this, we also realized that we can't do this by ourselves. Invest in Africa is just one of the players within the ecosystem. We realized that we needed to focus on more cohesive partnerships and collaborations in order to co-create effective solutions that will enhance the risk awareness and mitigation strategies. We also realized early enough that this requires a proper SME-focused risk and resilience framework that will help us to focus on this topic of disasters from a holistic perspective and guide future actions by Invest in Africa and also by other stakeholders. So this is what informs this dialogue, and this is why we have gone out of our way to invite stakeholders from across different countries. So we have crafted this dialogue as a three-part series with the objective of achieving three key goals as projected today. One is that the series seeks to increase risk visibility and an awareness of disaster risk to SMEs and also to stakeholders. We want to talk about this, we want to make these issues visible within the ecosystem. And then second, we really intend to catalyze investment in disaster risk management. And thirdly, is to drive commitment and action towards developing a framework. As I have rightly put it, we need a proper framework that will guide all the actions and one that fosters an integrated approach to how we reduce disaster risk rather than just respond with short-term interventions, and to support this from a governance perspective from SMEs. And we believe that when we do that, we will be building sustainable companies. And we believe in Africa, as Invest in Africa, that the future really is Africa. And if we develop SMEs in a sustainable way, then it means that we have jobs not only for today, but jobs that can be secured for tomorrow. And we will not have to worry too much when we have disasters, because then we are looking at this from a preparedness, from a management and a mitigation perspective. And therefore today we are so honored to have our distinguished guests, our expert panelists to share with us best practice. I believe we have the best that does exist anywhere from their experience, their perspectives that we can learn from as we think and deliberate about an SME resilience framework. And as Caroline put it, she has lined up our guest today who will be leading us through the session. And allow me, ladies and gentlemen, because of time, to declare this dialogue session open and welcome all of you to the dialogue. So thank you very much and enjoy the session.
Thank you very much, Wangeshi, for the opening remarks. We'll move straight to the next session. And the session, I will just speak through some of the experiences we've had with SME in Invest in Africa. I'll begin by just giving a short introduction of what the SME sector looks like and how it has been affected. So the SMEs make about 80% of all businesses in Kenya, and I think this could be even in the rest of the world. So they are a very important part of any economy, and especially in Africa, SMEs are the biggest size businesses. And the pandemic has affected them, like Wangeshi has said, in various ways. Unfortunately, in Africa, most SME have not been prepared, were not prepared when the pandemic hit. And one of the challenges we have seen when we are offering risk advisory services is that most SMEs do not do business planning. And if they do business planning, it could be because maybe a financier or an investor requested them to present a business plan. And so incorporating disaster risk in planning is lacking. And it's a general challenge that we have when dealing with SMEs on matters risk. We've also realized that there is a huge knowledge gap, and the huge knowledge gap is because most SMEs say they have not been able to get adequate support. In fact, about 75 of SMEs have said they don't know where to get support in terms of business support services. And most of them are actually, they say these are actually quite difficult to be able to access these services. So some of the key risks that the pandemic has presented to the SMEs are the first one, which is reduced demand of goods and services. And this is due to the slowdown of economic activity due to the pandemic. In Kenya, the projected economic growth for 2020 was about 5.7%. And due to the pandemic, it's now projected to about 1.5%, meaning general slowdown of the economy. The other challenge that the SMEs face is supply chain disruptions. And this is a big challenge to SMEs, and this is due to the things which the government put in place to contain the pandemic, which are border closures, a cessation of movement across different regions, and also the flights were not operational. So one of these challenge, these are big challenge to SMEs as they seek to get their raw materials and transport their finished products to different destinations. The other challenge that SMEs have faced during this pandemic is total business closures. There are specific sectors, and especially those in the hospitality sector. We know that temporary closure of business, based on the research done by Invest in Africa, is about 43% of SMEs. 43% of the SMEs say they have temporarily closed their business, and about 7% say they have permanently closed their businesses. So this is a big challenge that SMEs have faced during this pandemic. And then the other issue is inability to meet operational costs because they're not able to sell their goods and services. They're not able to pay their bills. They're not able to even access financing, which is a big problem. We say that the SMEs have serious financial challenges, including payment of loans, and the research also showed that 48% of them say there is reduced investment activity in the country. Another problem that they face is businesses moving to virtual working spaces, and this presents other challenges, including data security, remote working supervision. Based on our experiences, the internal controls put by SMEs for physical working spaces, but now most of them are either moved to virtual working or combined virtual working and on-site, presenting serious challenges of supervision, data security, effectiveness in delivery, amongst other challenges. And the other bigger challenge as well that they face is human resource management. As people move to the virtual working spaces, the issue of effectiveness, management, absenteeism, as their staff are handling both business issues and family issues as they support their families in the various activities, including schooling. So some of the challenges based on human resources, some organizations have laid off staff, done salary cuts, and such kind of challenges that they face. So one of the things that Invest in Africa did due to this pandemic is interventions in terms of training. And we've held several sessions, 5 sessions in training, and the 5 sessions include identifying and managing top risks. And during those sessions, we helped SMEs identify risks, categorize the risks, determine the reason, the cause of those risks, and then come up with mitigating strategies to be able to deal with those risks. They went out with a tool which we call a risk plan or risk register, where they maintain and monitor their risks using that tool. We've held 3 sessions of this nature from March to September. Then we held a session on SME fraud risk training. And the reason this was very important is that the SMEs said one of the biggest challenges is to be able to manage fraud. And during these sessions, we did introduction to fraud. What is fraud? Why fraud exists in SMEs? We also did a global profile of a fraudster, presented the global profile of a fraudster so that you can be able to understand how that works. And then the red flags that they can identify even without consulting a specialist. So the red flags that they need to identify. And then we finalize the session using the asset misappropriation fraud, which is the highest fraud that SMEs face. So we've held 5 sessions in total, 2 sessions with MasterCard and 3 sessions with Invest in Africa, with the Invest in Africa members. Now, the feedback from these sessions is that the SMEs found the sessions very interactive and informative and very helpful for their businesses. The sessions, they said, should be regular and sustained. The sessions should be longer because we did online sessions, which are about 2 hours, and they said that they require more time to be able to understand the concepts and also familiarize themselves with some of these challenges. The other thing is that there is need for specific scenario planning. SMEs have now realized the importance of scenario planning to be able to plan their businesses better. And also they realize that they need a dedicated business support system. So those are some of the things that Invest in Africa has done in terms of risk and disaster risk management. At this point in time, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, and the most important thing that we'd like her to speak about is her experience in disaster risk management. She's a professional and has extensive experience. I will read her bio and then she can come in with her keynote. Her name is Margarita Wallström. She's the elected president of the Swedish Red Cross and has served the Swedish Red Cross and the Federation in various capacity for a total of 15 years. Previously, Ms. Wallström was a special representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and simultaneously head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Reduction, the focal point within the UN system for the coordination of disaster reduction, ensuring synergies with the regional organizations across the UN activities in social, economic development and humanitarian fields. Under her leadership, UN DRR designed and supported the inclusive consultations for and subsequently the intergovernmental negotiations leading to the SIDAI Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030, adopted in March 2015 by all UN member states. The SIDAI framework is the first of the 2015 global policy directions for the coming 15 years. Mrs. Wallstrom's broad experience spans conflict and non-conflict emergencies and addresses long-term issues of sustainable development. It gives me great pleasure to invite Mrs. Wallstrom to give her keynote address. Welcome very much, and in Kenya we say karibu sana to give your remarks.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Invest in Africa for inviting me to this session, which I have been so fascinated by your report on Kenya during the pandemic. So I think you almost fulfilled all expectations already. Thank you very much, Mangechi and Caroline. And I recognize that there are participants in this session from all over the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, and great that there is such an interest in this topic. We have so many specialists here, but so I will speak about my journey from probably disaster manager to a disaster risk reduction leader. For many years, I was hugely engaged in disasters around the world, very global ones, very tiny ones. But at some point, you know, you look at what you are doing in a sudden event and then you leave. But most people don't leave, they try to rebuild their lives. So in order to understand better the dynamics of disasters and what are the costs that disasters incur, not only the direct loss. If you think about the reporting in media about disasters, it's getting better, I must say, but of course what they report to us is the losses from this disaster is maybe $50 million. And what they are counting then are the things that are immediately broken. They do not count, because that's a much more complicated exercise, they do not count all the indirect losses, those that create long-term harm. For example, you can just imagine, first you have destroyed roads, you have transport disruption, people, your employees don't come to work, children don't go to school, hospitals are maybe damaged, talk earthquake or big floods or hurricanes, staff cannot come. You have power losses, you know, the power lines are blown out of the water, they are disrupted, the transmission systems don't work, etc., etc., water supplies. And this happens all the time, so who is counting the losses? And I started asking these questions when I went to disasters, and I found that actually no one counts. I asked municipal heads, so when you have to repair all the bridges after this flooding, how do you account for it in your books? And they say, well, you just put it into the normal maintenance cost. So it doesn't feature as a loss that has been incurred by disasters. And of course, by this way of accounting, it may seem to far too many governments and come to the private sector as well. They don't see the true cost of disasters. So when we try to, mainly in the UN system, but also nationally, we then started engaging with governments to try to test what will get their intention in actually working more on preparedness, risk reduction and resilience, rather than disaster response. As you know, most of you have been engaged in supporting communities once the disaster has hit. This can be a humanitarian gesture, and it is of great value, but it doesn't deal with the long-term effects of rebuilding a community, recreating jobs, creating sustainable jobs as you are doing. It doesn't deal with the total loss to society, that children are not going to school for maybe 3-4 months, worst case scenario, even years. It doesn't deal with the long-term health effects of disasters. So once you start asking questions, and you go beyond the disaster relief moment, you have to start understanding what gets people's attention. Is it the social suffering? I'm sorry to say no, that did not seem to be able to inspire people for change. The economics started waking up. And then the final thing that I think we also got to understand much better is that, and it was a politician who said it in a debate in Asia. He said, disaster became really serious for me when I realized that I can lose my job as a politician if I mishandle a disaster. So you see the scale of the economics and the political responsibility are the things that we can count on for actually changing the way we do business. So once you started uncovering this, you come to, I think Vangoche, Caroline already mentioned this. We cannot do this alone. The disaster community have traditionally, been national disaster management agencies, international community. But that's far from enough, obviously, and it doesn't actually answer the basic question. So when you start going to other communities, you start going to academics, and you say, well, we need more research, for example, in the long-term effects on education after disasters. What happens to the children that maybe not only once, but repeatedly over 10-15 years have disruptions in their education? What happens to the long-term effect of health issues? Not the sudden death, but what happens to people that are injured, maybe have other traumas? What is? And I must say there wasn't a lot of interest in the traditional disaster community for research here. But we made it our task to bring academics closer to us in the consultation work to get to the Sendai framework. So not only states and governments, but also the academic community, community groups, stakeholders, children, women, farmers, fishermen. We wanted everyone to come forward and speak to what are their issues and needs. And the private sector, because the private sector represents the major investments in society, they represent jobs. You cannot leave private sector out of this, but I must say it took some time before we managed to create a sense of self-interest, because this is a matter of self-interest. You have to realize your own vulnerabilities. What is the cost of your own losses? What do your employees expect of you as a private actor? So within that, we started with big multinationals, and as I started by describing, if you don't identify the cost of disasters to your own business, if it doesn't show up in your books, of course, it may not seem terribly important. And if you are a big multinational, you can move your production or your activities quite easily across borders, which means that in a way you are also free to also feel that you don't incur big losses. So that whole process of engaging with companies to start looking at, how do you account for losses? How do you account for disruption? How do you account for maybe reputational losses if you close your business, as Vangoche just reported? How do you account for these collateral damages that happens if you don't? But once you start looking at it, and that's when we started engaging also with the big multinationals on this. When it comes to the SMEs, and that's when you look also at the community level, very concrete things. Looking at communities' possibility to recover after disaster, you also look at the resilience and sustainability of the SMEs. The SMEs are the ones that are critical to the recovery of communities, and anything that SMEs do to become more resilient, more sustainable, will assist communities in recovery. But as you have very well described, I recognize everything that you reported from Kenya, also from our experiences. Do not understand risk so well, how risk is a not only all of society, but it is all of spectrum disasters. We always say in the disaster business that once we've had a disaster, when we plan to do better in the next one, we plan for exactly the same event to happen again. And of course, that never happens. Who had planned for a pandemic, even though pandemics is very high on the agenda in the disaster risk management frameworks in many countries, in international organizations. We all planned for pandemics. How well prepared were we? Because it's very hard to actually realize what it means, even though we saw, particularly in Africa, during the big Ebola outbreak some years ago, you saw the same thing happen: border closures, transport system failing, fear, public fear. How do we deal with public communications? And in this era of social media, who holds the truth? Who is the authoritative speaker that can advise the population, advise everyone who takes decision? It is quite complicated. So the risk of planning the next disaster after the one that we just had now is another risk to really try to mitigate for. But when we look at what everywhere, the SMEs all around the world, they are part today, many of them, they are a local ecosystem, but they are also very often part of a global supply chain. And we are all part of that global supply chain in a way. So what you just described as the reality in Kenya for the SMEs now is so true for every country in the world. And how to work, and I think your model speaks, has a lot of value, how to work with the SMEs to compensate for, because you are small, you also have limited resources. And I think small companies, big ones, but also governments, the way we think and operate, and you all know that, the important falls down the list for the urgent today. And everyone in a decision-making position, you have to take a decision that normally, or all too often I should say, deals with today's issues rather than the ones that will become a reality in 10 years. And this is a dilemma that many of us will have to deal with, but we also have to find out how can we assist, in your case, SMEs or others, governments. How do we understand the situation in which they take decisions so we can offer tools and instruments that create that understanding, but also helps them to take sometimes uncomfortable decisions and explain them to the public, to the shareholders, to the boardroom, depending on where you are in the system. So having said all this, investing in financing risk management, financing disaster risk management, financing the small and middle-sized companies, I think is one of the best instruments for building sustainability, both in the local community, but also national economies. The proximity between people's daily life and their jobs and the production is key to sustainability. But if you are small, you certainly can't do it alone. You can't do it alone when you're big either. So in the period leading to Sendai also, we were thinking, because we were a small office, so we were really thinking about how do we reach out. And we started a campaign for cities, for building resilient cities and eventually resilient communities, because there was a lot of discussion what is the definition of a city. So to avoid that, we started also making a more complex definition. But that was built on them working together. A small organization could support a giant network by helping them to work together through platforms, building on their knowledge, providing tools, having a bit of fun occasionally, also providing role models, appointing ambassadors around the world who engage with their communities, who they know. So when you are small with limited resources, you have to find also innovative way of achieving big things. And I think that's one of the models that we can really use and benefit from. Capital is one of the things you mentioned for the SMEs. I think what we have seen, one of the surprising things of the pandemic and the economy in my own country during this year, and because the assumption was that the SMEs would suffer more than everybody else in the business sector. But it has turned out also that SMEs were much more agile and clever on how to change, and quicker on how to change the business model, finding new ways of doing things. So once now, just recently, they looked at the results here in Sweden, they found that the very pessimistic projections had not come true in that sector, actually. So that agility maybe is something that we should all put forward as a good argument, also to encourage venture capital, development partners, to invest much more in SMEs in the many new sectors that actually are the result also of the climate change, going from non-fossil fuel, biodiversity issues. There must be a whole range of new opportunities that maybe best are nurtured in SMEs before it becomes big business. So I think as we move along, I think also we should really speak to the very positive opportunities around being an SME and try to develop those skill sets and the talents and the smartness that comes with being a relatively limited employer and opportunities. And my final point maybe here, and I look forward to listen to Michael and other speakers. We calculate, and when we think about the history of global disasters and big disasters in the world, it goes back and on record many thousands of years. And for all of us who did not know about tsunami, there was a really big tsunami over 300 years ago here in Europe, which destroyed the capital of Portugal at that time, Lisbon. So when we start looking at disasters, it's a phenomena that is in history talked about a sudden disruption. It can be food security crises, it can be volcano eruptions, it can be big storms. But when you start looking closer, we can also see that change has been generated through these disasters. And maybe that's also something we should consider as we move forward. What change did it generate? How can we turn the change into an opportunity? And because disasters will happen, because it's not acceptable that lives are lost, because the costs are enormous and much bigger than counted for. Disasters is not a humanitarian issue, or it's really fundamentally a development issue. And here we have a dilemma. You have it in your countries, you have it regionally, you probably have it in the private sector. We have not really been able to cross that line yet, that the investment that you make in disaster preparedness, in risk knowledge, in understanding the economics of disasters, that investment is a development investment for sustainability and resilience, which will pay off. Maybe it takes 10 years, maybe 20 years, maybe next year, but it will pay off. Because through history, we also know that the biggest disasters are those that have not happened yet, because we have not anticipated how it's going to work for us. Thank you. Now I look forward to listen to everybody else.
Wow, great. Thank you for the great insights. The biggest disasters have not happened yet. The next session is with Michael Vincent, quickly taking off from that high note, knowing that we have not yet experienced the next disaster, and that the investment we are making in this session, investment in risk knowledge, is a part of development and sustainability. So the next session will be taken by Michael Vincent. So Michael, he has an outstanding track record in successful implementation of large-scale projects in business recovery strategies, programs across the Caribbean region, with over 25 years experience in financial services, which includes commercial, operational risk, and business continuity planning. He has worked with the Barbados National Bank, spearheading the bank's policies and procedures, and subsequently heading the banking operations department before joining the CIBC First Caribbean International Bank, where he worked closely with the executive management in designing and setting up operational risk framework, including internal control systems. For over 15 years, Michael managed the business continuity management program for CIBC First Caribbean International Bank, which has operation in 17 islands within the Eastern Caribbean basin. He has vast knowledge and understanding of operational risk with extensive experience in disaster recovery plan. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Michael to make his remarks. Michael.
Yes. Hi, good afternoon to all. I want to thank Caroline for the introduction. And as she indicated, in terms of my background, the topic of understanding risk is one of utmost interest to me. Coming from one of the small islands, states, and I have spent, I guess, quite a bit of time being engaged in the overall process in regard to operational risk. I think based on the delivery of Margareta, I think she has laid the driveway for my presentation, which most of the information that she provided is somewhat contained in my presentation, which is very interesting in terms of the linkages between the whole issue of understanding risk and business continuity. As I go through these slides, I would try to share with you the overall concept in regard to the process in identifying risk. In the present day, the need for risk management is partially driven by environmental, economic, and political considerations as indicated by Margareta. In regard to risk management, as most of you are aware, no business is without risk. Risk management is critically important and significant. It allows the business to prevent and minimize the financial, political, and social challenges associated with the risk event. There are basically two critical key factors that must be taken into consideration when evaluating risk. The probability and the impact. And the impact is always of great concern, as indicated by the prior speaker. The impact can be extremely traumatic to not just individuals, but to SMEs as well. And what is risk? I think most of us have used the word risk in our daily lives. For example, you may indicate that you risk losing your driver's license because of some infraction. You risk losing your promotion or a job because of lack of performance. You risk losing your car insurance because you've missed some level of payment. So in terms of the word risk, most of us in our lives have used that term in some form or the other. So risk can be defined as an event or circumstance that has a negative impact on your business or in your personal life. The types of risk varies from business to business, whether you're SME or large conglomerate, you are exposed to risk events. The important thing is that senior management must decide on how much risk they are prepared to take in the business. And again, some risks may be critical to your success. And you have to ensure that exposing your business to the wrong type of risk is in fact catastrophic. The most common business risk groups, which is not just limited, but it includes the strategic risk, the compliance. One of key interest is financial. Most SMEs, whether small, large, or medium, tend to focus on the financial impact on the business. The environmental risk is extremely critical because most of us are exposed in some form or the other in terms of the environmental risk, in terms of the hurricanes, the floods, the fires, civil unrest. So then a whole host of environmental issues which could have significant impact on your business. And we've identified some of the areas that you may be familiar with, or you are familiar with, sorry, in terms of the locust invasion in Kenya, which has a significant impact on your food supply. We've also identified or highlighted the earthquake in Haiti, which, as you may have heard, did create some significant challenges for Haiti. The typhoon in Japan. And taking the issue back home is the flooding in Kenya as we speak. And then we have the Savo fire, which is raging, I understand, as we speak right now, or has been under some control. One of the other types of risks, which in most cases tend to be misunderstood by SMEs, is civil unrest and the impact on civil unrest in terms of you being able to get your employees into work on time, and also the whole issue of power outages. And you also have the bomb scare, which obviously is a major impact or major impediment in terms of having your staff to do an immediate evacuation, which also has a major impact on the business. And health and safety, the COVID-19 pandemic, which we all know is creating some serious challenges across the globe. Many countries, or most countries, are experiencing some significant downtime in terms of productivity, loss of income, etc., etc. So this pandemic has taught the world that planning is essentially and very critical in the overall process in terms of trying to understand the whole issue of risk. As I did indicate, in terms of the impact on COVID, you have large-scale layoffs, business closures across the globe, whether it's retail, hospitality sectors, all segments have been impacted. There's some areas, for example, in Nigeria, they were able to reallocate their resources in terms of utilizing a national stadium to become a temporary health facility. The most critical thing in trying to help you identify risks is to create a business plan. And during the business plan, it helps you to evaluate each function in your business and identify anything that could have a negative impact on your business. For example, the SWOT analysis, which is looking at your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities and your threats. It's always recommended that you review your records for safety incidents, maintenance schedules, etc. Always consider the external risks that impact your own business. For example, the external risk could be, as I mentioned before, civil unrest, which you perhaps have no control over. COVID, as you're aware. So there are a number of external factors that could have significant impact on your business. We always recommend that you engage your staff in trying to help evaluate the risk. It's critical that you consider the impacts each risk has on the operations, and also, in some cases, you may consider expanding your business, and there is inherent risk in doing so. So that also should be taken into consideration. And of significance as well is the likelihood and the frequency of it occurring. Always consider the impact and the consequence if it occurs. The consequence or the impact could range from medium, I guess, to high, depending on the level of impact. There are a number of ways which is recommended to manage the risk. And that includes risk avoidance, risk reduction, risk transfer, and more importantly, risk acceptance. Good risk management will help your business continue in operations. Avoidance, change your business processes, because that can have an impact on the overall business. If a risk can be avoided, reduce its likelihood and consequence. This includes, but not limited to, following: staff training. And one of the significant points that must be raised is most SMEs tend to lack adequate documentation. So it's critical that we provide policies and procedures to assist in the overall process. I'm complying with laws and regulations. Ensure, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the bomb scare, there's always a need to have a proper plan for your emergency procedures in case staff do have to evacuate your building on a very short notice. There has to be a detailed plan in terms of the process for emergency. And also, because of the whole issue of fraud, cyber fraud, you have to ensure that the safety of your records is in fact critical. And the last point is contingency planning, which is extremely critical, as highlighted by Margarita. There has to be a detailed plan to ensure that the impact is minimized and the recovery process is quick and swift. In terms of the risk acceptance, in most cases, this may be your only option, and it always makes much more business sense to document the process so a decision can be made in terms of accepting the risk and see how quickly we could mitigate the impact if the risks do materialize. In terms of the overall process, it's always, again, critical to ensure that there's an ongoing process to monitor and review your risk profile. So we always recommend that there has to be a frequent review of the process, whether it's quarterly, annually, semi-annually. It's based on your size, but there has to be a frequent and continuous review. And always ensure that there's some level of coverage in terms of insurance coverage. Now, I know that for small SMEs, insurance coverage can be expensive, but there has to be some level of negotiation to see how you can manage and ensure that your entity or your SME is insured against the unforeseen. And testing is highly recommended. In most cases, it is recommended that we test at least twice a year. In some cases, you could do an annual test, but it's always important to do testing on a regular basis, because the testing it's one thing to have your plan on paper, but if it's not tested on a regular and ongoing basis, then the paper is worthless to you. So you have to ensure that there's a structure in place to ensure testing is ongoing, whether it's every 6 months, every year, every quarter. It doesn't have to be a live test. It could be what we term a tabletop testing, where you bring your team together and you walk through the various scenarios in the event that there's a disruption. So your entire team is familiar with the process end to end. Again, I just want to close by saying that it's always very, very, I guess, critical to ensure that as an SME, you have to ensure, as an SME, sorry, you have to ensure that you're in control of your internal risk once you've identified the issue. Risk, as I said, is very prevalent in all SMEs. So the important thing is to gain control. And once you gain control, you could identify steps, I guess, to mitigate the impact. Because the ultimate goal is to minimize the effects of risk on your business, whether it's internal or external. And internal, as we know, could be from various sources, but external is the areas that you basically have no control over. So you have to ensure that plans are in place to minimize the impact. Another issue that tend to be overlooked by SMEs, risk can also come from a positive source as well. You may decide to grow your business, and in that growth process, there is inherent risk. So as you plan to broaden your business model, you have to be aware that in doing this, there is some level of risk. And don't be afraid to get help from an outside source to help you identify the areas of risk. Because in some cases, you don't have all the answers, and you may need some assistance to help you guide the process. And as I said before, ongoing review is highly critical in terms of ensuring that you maintain a very broad perspective of the inherent risk in your business and arrangements in place to mitigate the impact. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your great remarks. Just to say that you have talked about very key aspects of risk management. You've talked about some key risk drivers, and the key risk drivers include economic activity, political environment. Just to state that in Kenya, we go through a 5-year cycle, election cycle, which presents serious risks to SMEs, where there is investor apathy, there is closure of businesses due to insecurity. So that's a key risk driver. Another key risk driver that you have mentioned is the environmental risk. In Kenya, we have the risk of floods, which are periodic in Kenya, affecting SMEs and such kind of things. We also have the current most recent fires in the Tsavo National Park, which is the biggest reserve in Kenya. And the question is, as an SME, you said we need to be prepared. How do we prepare for a flood? How do we prepare for risks to do with the political situation? To enable us answer this question, we have with us Joseph Kuria. Joseph Kuria holds a degree in environmental science from Kenyatta University. He has 8 years experience in both the public and the private and NGO sector as an environmental specialist. Currently supports MEDA Kenya to promote environmental sustainability and to promote and promotion of green and safe technologies of SMEs. And he supports a program called the MSAWA program, which supports agriculture, construction, mining, and the extractive sectors. So to help us answer the question today, Joseph will answer the question, why is it critical to advocate for the inclusion of climate change risk consideration in SMEs? Why is it critical to advocate for inclusion for climate risk consideration in SMEs? Joseph, if you could take it away from here. Welcome and give your remarks.
All protocols observed. Good morning, good day, wherever you are. Looking at the conversation, the way it has started, I'd like to point out 3 key information that I've collected. This includes cost of disasters, as highlighted by Ms. Margareta, where we are looking at lack of costing in budget and poor handling of disasters can cause detrimental effects. So I'm also looking in terms of environmental perspective, where we're looking at failure to be able to have the cost for decontamination of sites where SMEs work, can be able to lead into poor management of such disasters when they occur. The other thing is to recognize the importance of communities, local communities, as the forefront of disaster recovery. We as MEDA, we are also looking at beginning supporting our target beneficiaries from the SEs side at the grassroots level as we climb up the chain. And I think it is very important because they're the ones who go to help us in times of need before proper help can be able to be outsourced. The other thing is the agility that was mentioned about of the Swedish business people, SMEs. I was trying to look at it also in terms of the Kenyan perspective, where a few years back Kenya imposed a ban on travel, on plastic bans, on plastic use. And I think businesses and SMEs have been able to adapt quickly so that they can be able to continue their business in terms of continuity. So when also looking in terms of risk, the types of risk that Michael indicated, I think it is also important to note what he said about risks are critical to business success. And this brings us to what we are looking at in terms of climate risk. And basically, with climate risk, we look at environmental exposures, whether physical, chemical, or biological, that can induce a harmful response to affect soil, water, or natural resources arising out of an organization activities. So let me bring this into perspective. Experts agree that the Industrial Revolution was the turning point when emissions of greenhouse effect gases entering the atmosphere began to soar. These were all in quest to create a newer model for production and also consumption. The main impact has been the increase in global temperature of our planet, our country. However, it is estimated that by the end of the present century, the thermometer could rise by 2.7 degrees Celsius, even if the national commitments to reduce emissions as per the Paris Agreement are fulfilled. So global warming has led to the worst climate change impacts in globally. Kenya is already feeling the effects of climate change, especially as we are largely dependent on rainfed agriculture and tourism, which are very susceptible to climate variability and change to extreme weather events. So according to climate risk profile done by USAID in 2018, the drought period between 2011 and 2008 to 2011, it is estimated that it costed Kenya 12.1 billion in losses and damages, and also a sea level rise of 30 centimeter is estimated to threaten at least 17% of Mombasa within the ocean. So this roughly reflects to around 4,600 hectares of Mombasa Island being sunk. So this is likely to affect also the tourism business in the long run within the coastal region. Other examples of layered impacts of climate change in Kenya has been talked about is the locust invasion. And I think a report by World Bank indicated that by June of this year, they had anticipated at least 400-fold in terms of the swarm, locust swarm being experienced, which was likely to cause livestock-related damages, costing to a tune of 8.5 billion by the end of 2020, as well as the rising waters in Lake Baringo and Bogoria. On the other hand, have damages business, schools, homes, hotels, while bringing dangerous animals close to people. So currently, there is a concern that both lakes could merge, which could cause contamination and threaten the wildlife even more. In matters of health and safety risks, I'd like to point out that there is a low priority given to health and safety activities in small businesses. SMEs tend to underestimate the risk posed by their workplaces. Regulations are often viewed as overly complex as a company. Health and safety is not recognized as a key business objective. So most common hazards within a workplace with regards to our discussion today include chemical hazards. These are hazardous substances that can cause harm. For instances, we might have SMEs today who deal with the sale of chemicals, either to make homemade soaps, which is a little bit common these days, disinfectant, and any spillage can result in both health and environmental impacts. ranging from skin, respiratory system irritation to blindness and also explosion if the chemicals were stored haphazardly. And this ultimately will lead to pollution of either water sources, air pollution, as well as our soils. The other issue is safety hazards. These mostly I'm looking in terms of unsafe working conditions within a business. For example, we might have a processing company with unguarded moving machineries parts, which pose a safety hazard as any employee can sustain serious injuries and can lead even to death. So in the event a small business has not insured itself, as what Michael was saying earlier on in terms of insurance, under the Work Injury Benefit Act within the Kenyan regulations, liability for compensation can impact the financial health of an organization. So the question that remains is there hope for generating more effective coordinated risk planning and mitigation response within the SMEs and partners? Well, SMEs are considered vulnerable to climate change effects, largely due to lack of financial strength, institutional and technological capacities. We at MIDA Kenya are currently supporting 24 SMEs and 8 business associations through our MSAWA project. As the project environment specialist, we are promoting environmental sustainability through various adaptation and mitigation strategies for both SMEs and SEs. For instance, Kenya Livestock Marketing Council, KLMC, is one of our business associations that we're supporting, and they're leading the way in provision of downscaled weather information and pasture location to reach pastoralists in Turkana and Samburu counties using vernacular radio station and SMS where the network is a little bit favorable. This kind of information this kind of information allows our pastoralists to take preventive measures in terms of securing their livestock and protect their source of livelihood as actors within the meat value chain. And I think this kind of strategy or support really reflects on the Sendai framework target 3 of investing in disaster reduction and resilience. The other example that I'd like to give is we have a chili export company called Equator. We are currently supporting them establish demo sites to promote water harvesting techniques by use of new technology known as the drizzle kits, which can hold up to 40,000 liters of water. And this is very beneficial compared to what we normally use, the plastic containers, the plastic water tanks, which are prone to breaking up once they've been exposed to extreme sun to the extreme sunset. Sorry, to the extreme sun over a long period of time. This is targeted to help farmers irrigate their chili fields all year round instead of depending on rain-fed agriculture within Kilifi. As Margareta said, history has proven not all risks can be averted, but in order to enhance investment that aims to reduce vulnerability and build resilience, it is my opinion that we all need to manage risk, not just disasters, by addressing pre-existing risks and avoiding the development of new risks. All these can be done once a risk analysis has been undertaken of respective business operations. 2, SMEs need to invest in early warning systems. What do I mean by this? Is basically by engaging essential personnel within the planning process to identify gaps in terms of either resources, collaborations, to allow businesses have an improved response level. This may include forming of an environmental health and safety committee for your respective organizations. So food for thought will be parts of the country experienced tremors in August, and as a business out there, what is your level of preparedness, or what was your level of preparedness in the likelihood of an earthquake hitting your business? So kind of being exposed to this kind of information is very, very important, and it can only be possible through collaboration and also coming up with systems. And then the third opinion that I'd like to give out is SMEs need to adopt elements of national program spearheaded by government of Kenya to respond to the challenges of climate change that is posing to Kenya's socio-economic development. For instance, it is envisioned that Kenya will be a green economy by 2020. What does this mean for SMEs? There are opportunities, which I think tallies well with what Margareta said also, where we need to change, to look at the changes, to turn changes into opportunities. And this can come in form of pursuing energy efficiency options, such as the use of solar, conducting energy audits for medium-sized businesses, and also for upcoming or businesses that are looking to scale up. Their new buildings they need to consider green buildings where they can be able to use much light as possible to avoid direct heating from the sun in order to minimize energy requirements. Finally, I would like to finish by quoting the late Nobel Prize winner, Wangari Maathai. She said, "The environment and the economy are really both two sides of the same coin. If we cannot sustain the environment, we cannot sustain ourselves." Therefore, I urge entrepreneurs present to embrace, one, the 3 R's of waste management, that is reduce, reuse, and recycle. All these will help to cut down the amount of waste we throw away and conserve natural resources, landfill space, and energy required. And then we need to move more into a circular economy, since it is seen as a way to benefit the environment, as well as improve the security of the supply raw material, increasing competitiveness and stimulating innovation, thus boosting economic growth. And the last thing that I'd like to put out across is, as businesses, there are the 3 P's of sustainability, that is people, planet, and profits. It is important that SMEs capture the essence of sustainability by measuring the impacts of their organizations to the world and their immediate environment. This might include profitability and shareholders' values and its social, human, and environment capital.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for your remarks and very critical contributions to this session. Just to maybe point out in terms of highlights of what you have said, in terms of the types of risks you talked about. Climate risk, which we need to consider environment, chemical and biological matters that affect water and soil and the natural resources. You also spoke about the industrial revolution and it has had on the globe, and you spoke about issues to do with increased temperature. You also spoke about the effects that it has done, especially on Africa and Kenya, where we do rain-fed agriculture, and its effects on tourism that needs to be considered. You also spoke about the cost of drought, which amounts to 12.1 billion in terms of losses and damages to the country. You also spoke about the threat, the threat to land in Mombasa. You said about 14,000 hectares of land will be sinking. You also spoke about the locust invasion, and you said that some of the impacts of the locust invasion will include rise in water in Baringo and Bogoria, the Lake Baringo and Lake Bogoria, and you say there are damages in schools, homesteads, exposing people to different challenges, and you said that it's foreseen that the two lakes may merge, and that will bring challenges in terms of human health. You also spoke about low priority given by SME in terms of health and safety. And I remember you also spoke about regulation being viewed as complex and unnecessary, and it exposes people to things to do with chemical hazards and such kind of hazards. You also spoke about the issue of handling chemicals, especially for SMEs doing manufacture of soaps, the issue of spillage that they do, and this brings environmental erosion. And you spoke about pollution of water sources by this kind of SMEs that are there. You also spoke about some of the things that you're doing in the MSAWA program, which is supporting SMEs in terms of environmental conservation. And you spoke about KLMC, which is working in the Kenya livestock sector. And you also spoke about matters to do with your opinion on risk management, and you spoke about the issues of dealing with pre-existing risks, which I totally agree with as a risk professional, before you deal with the emerging risks. You also spoke about investment in early warning systems, which is one of the key elements of risk management, knowing that the fuel tank is approaching E and you need to fill it up. You also spoke about the traumas that happened in August. I'm not sure any SME has thought about the impacts of that trauma that happened in Kenya, and I think this is one of the critical points that we need to take up. And then you also spoke about adaptation of the national program to elements of climate change. I guess part of our strategy going forward is ensuring that SMEs have access to this national program on climate change so that they can be able to make adjustments in their planning. And you also spoke about the green economy and some opportunities which arise by that. I think as Invest in Africa, we need to look at this and see what opportunities. You talked about energy audits, buildings which are green buildings, considering the impact to sun and all that. And you also spoke about the 3 R's of energy conservation and also the 3 P's. I think that you had a great presentation. We will take up those points and see how, as Invest in Africa, we can continue supporting SMEs in this complex matter. We will then move forward to the next panel session. The next panel session will be done by Iman Tariq. Iman Tariq, he's a director at Office of Development Credit and of the Development Finance Corporation. He's a director of Office of Development Credit at the Development Finance Corporation, DFC. He's an international development financier with 20 years record experience of executing debt and equity transactions in over 36 countries. We will want to welcome him, and he'll be speaking about he'll be speaking on the issues of risk in matters of risk reduction, risk avoidance, and risk transfer, the mitigating issues of those risks that we have talked about. So we'd welcome Iman to speak on these matters for the next 5 to 8 minutes.
Okay, thanks for having me, and thanks for that introduction. I did want to explain that I am currently with the DFC, as was mentioned, and DFC is formerly known as OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and we serve as the United States government's development finance institution. And what I like to cover today is, as mentioned, primarily. Uh, Solutions, developing tools and existing tools for risk reduction. At DFC, we have a robust political risk insurance uh, program, which has been in existence for approximately 40 years. But I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus more on some of the ways to develop more tools and some of the existing tools for disaster um, risk. I think one of the big problems that faces SMEs in terms of disaster risk is that SMEs are generally expected to absorb and to retain these large risks, which, for the most part, SMEs aren't necessarily best positioned to take. So that's a very tall order, for us in industry as lenders, or as uh, from government perspective, or from a policy perspective, to expect a very small business to absorb risks that can, basically have the impact of shutting down firms or even industries and economies. Um, when I look at risk transfer, I think of it as a there's a spectrum, or a progression on a spectrum of which parties can best absorb and assume those types of risks. And so, on one hand, you have these very small firms, which are primarily concerned about, um, meeting their payroll and delivering their products to their customers. And on the other hand, you have very large companies, private sector companies, including insurance companies. You also have governments that have larger budgets, much larger budgets than these SMEs. But for private sector companies, like private sector insurance, to retain these type of disaster risks, it requires a lot of capital for them. It requires standards to be developed. It also requires technology to reach the SMEs, to reach their customers. And that's something that doesn't exist in a lot of markets and a lot of cases, particularly when we're looking uh, at the African continent. Uh, the contrast is looking at institutions like the Lloyd's insurance market, larger insurance companies that serve um, larger companies, larger corporations, multinational corporations, um, that have solutions for those larger businesses, but not necessarily SMEs in Africa specifically. So that end of the spectrum is, let's say, it's underdeveloped for the African SME market. But in order to develop that market, we're really relying on state actors to do that, on governments, and also donor institutions, NGOs, to work with these state actors to develop the proof of concept for different approaches to ensuring these risks, and taking these risks off the hands of SMEs. So develop the track record, also develop the technology, and to start developing the uh, the relationship between government actors and private sector companies that could then take the lead, eventually, once that track record is developed. An example of those kind of relationships would be within the donor community, NGO community, USAID, um, and other um, institutions like the World Food Program, Oxfam. There are several um, examples of index insurance in the agriculture sector. Joseph, who preceded me, cited a couple of examples of index insurance for livestock, the index-based livestock insurance program, and also the Kenya livestock insurance program. which uses technology and data to provide insurance, to develop a program to provide insurance to pastoralists and herders in Kenya, and that's based on having some of these institutions like USAID work with private insurance companies and work with the government, host country government, to develop these tools that are accessible to SMEs and even uh, micro micro-size businesses. So that's one way that we're seeing where these tools are being developed in uh, to become more market oriented and more sustainable for private companies to provide these type of services and take that burden off of SMEs. I think there's also part of the conversation. I think we've addressed it, and I think it's important to also mention that working on risk reduction is an important piece of the puzzle. It's not just about risk transfer, but doing so requires that there's certain know-how, certain technology, and certain funding to be made available to SMEs to encourage them and to support them in taking different approaches to their business models to make those business models more sustainable and more resilient, so that when they're facing disasters, that their businesses are more able to cope with those disasters and don't need as much of the insurance support in order to replace assets or replace income. So I think those two elements are really linked in terms of providing insurance, but the technology and the know-how for risk reduction. And then finally, on that spectrum that I talked about with the large companies, insurance companies, and governments on one side, and then the SMEs on the other, there are things that SMEs can do in order to mitigate their risk and also to transfer some of their risk. Some of the things are pretty expensive for SMEs. So I don't think in terms of industry these are long-term solutions, but some of the things that we do as lenders at DFC are for certain sectors that are more exposed to risk, like in the agriculture sector, that are subject to either like weather, climate risk, pests, like locust type of risk. Um, for those kind of businesses, we work with the SMEs by providing funding, but we require more equity to be provided by the SME in order for us to make the loan. So that does protect both parties because there's more equity capital to absorb some of the risk, so it protects us as a lender. But it's more expensive for the SMEs, and we all know that SMEs are generally capital constrained. It's not a long-term sustainable solution. We definitely will want to see other solutions. Um, and then there are some other creative approaches that SMEs and lenders can take, such as the repayment terms of a loan. Instead of having a traditional repayment term where there's a annual payment that's going to pay down the loan, um, lenders can consider looking at longer payment windows where we're looking at a 2-year, a 3-year kind of cycle um, of payments where there are some options, so that in the event that a firm is experiencing a shock from climate risk or weather risk, for example, and their production is low in 1 year, that the payment expectation is not rigid, it's not firm, so that there could be some flexibility to make those principal payments the following year once the business has started to recover. We can also link the repayment of loans to the production and to the profitability of the company that's making that's borrowing the funding also. So by lenders and borrowers taking more creative approaches to financing, that's one way to mitigate losses. So lastly, I would say contingency planning is something that is really standard for us to look at as a lender when we're working with SMEs. So requiring reserve accounts, for example, where the SME is going to put aside some cash or some capital, which can be used to make repayments on their loan in the event of shocks or disaster situations. Sometimes we also allow the borrower to tap those reserve accounts to use to help shore up their business in a disaster scenario. So it's not just that the lender is worried about getting repaid as quickly as possible, but also being able to use those reserve accounts to help sustain the business and to invest and double down in the business in the face of different shocks. So, I really just want to give a full perspective on, how we can continue to develop more tools, and then just a few examples of some of the tools and some of the different creative approaches that are available to SMEs right now. But the big takeaway I hope to provide is that that SMEs are not necessarily best positioned to bear the brunt of disasters on their shoulders without connections and without tools in the public sector, and also from larger players in the private sector.
Thank you very much for that quite good brief. And maybe I can just recap maybe 2 or 3 points of what it is that you've said as we move to the next speaker. You've talked about developing solutions for risk reduction, and you've talked about risk insurance programs. And you said you have one for 40 years. I can say that in Kenya, we actually our insurance products need to be developed to be able to maybe take care of some of the challenges that are presented in risk, especially in terms of environmental risk. I think we don't have adequate insurance programs, and I think that's one of the things you've said. And then you've said about risk transfer. You've talked about the spectrum best to absorb risks for small for small farms. SMEs require capital, they require technology to be able to deal with some of the risks that they face, and that I actually totally agree on that, and that is very important for our markets. You also spoke about risk reduction, and risk reduction is actually an alternative to insurance. And you talked about the matters of technology that maybe need to be developed, that the aspect of know-how, that is capacity building of SMEs. And you also spoke about funding to SMEs to make them more resilient. I think that risk reduction is very critical, especially for SMEs who may not be able to afford risk insurance, which is very important. And I like those points about risk reduction because I think that's critical. You also spoke about SMEs to mitigate risk by in terms of getting equity and capital on board, which is one of the challenges that we have in financing, and I think we'll be hearing later. And you talked about getting equity into the business, hence cushioning the business from actually borrowing. And that's a good one, where then the SME gets equity financing instead of getting loaning, and then they can be able to expand their operations and reduce their risks. A very important point for SMEs. Then you talked about creative approaches to financing. And you spoke about spreading payments to a longer term, 2 years, 3 years. I'm not sure we have any kind of financing like that from our insurance, from our financial institutions. And that's a great way of financing SMEs, especially the ones in the agribusiness sector where their production is not predictable, and based on what Joseph said, that we depend on fed agriculture. So that is critical. And then the last point that you raised, critical point on contingency planning and reserve accounts. this is about having the SME put up aside capital to make repayments of loan. I think that's a fabulous point there. Just to note that most of the SMEs actually have zero reserves, financial reserves. It's not something that is common. I guess for us as risk advisors is to be able to pass on this knowledge and see how SMEs can build on a reserve and maybe invest it in some treasury bills or bonds or offshore investments to be able to see how they can use such funds for risk management. We'll move to the next panel session, and the next panel session will be from a Kenyan entrepreneur, a woman entrepreneur in Kenya. And her name is Mary Ngeshu, and Mary Ngeshu is a director of Lime Plus group of companies, a packaging company providing packaging solutions, serving a wide range of clients, including food and beverage, cosmetics, agrovet, and pharmaceuticals in East Africa. Mary is a social entrepreneur who is passionate about skills development and decent jobs in the Kenyan manufacturing industry. She was celebrated by UN in Kenya, Kenya Person of the Year 2017 runners-up. She was also celebrated by Ernst & Young, East Africa Entrepreneur of the Year 2018, winning the woman category. And then again by the Zuri Awards of 2019 as a woman in manufacturing. In April 2019, Mary received the Diversity and Inclusion Eminent Leaders Award. She's a founder, member of the Women in Manufacturing under the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, and also a board member of the East Africa Business Council. Mary's enterprises are signatories of the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, a set of principles for businesses offering guidance on how to empower women in the workplace and community. So today, Mary is going to be speaking about her experience in business. And just a brief of what she's going to speak to, manufacturing and supply chains have been adversely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that the effects of the locust invasion and the recent flooding in Kenya will present additional challenges for an already struggling SME sector. So Mary will give her perspective in terms of benefits of integrating disaster risk consideration into SMEs manufacturing and supply chain operations, and also borrowing from what we have heard from other speakers. I believe that Mary is the best person to be able to speak to this based on her experience in manufacturing. So we welcome Mary Ngesho to give her remarks. Mary?
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my experience through this COVID disaster that we've gone through. As a manufacturer, as an entrepreneur, I will talk from an entrepreneur mind, from the day-to-day experience of how it is that I've learned and managed my business. So I will talk about what are those questions that we need to ask ourselves when we are talking about risk management. So I will talk about the questions that we need to ask ourselves through our supplies, our processes, our products, our customers, and our human resource. So as an SME, as an entrepreneur, in our supplies, there are several questions that we need to ask ourselves. We need to ask ourselves where our raw materials coming from. We need to have a clear understanding of our supply value chain so that we are able to, if our supply value chain is affected, we can be able to see ahead and be able to interpret what effect that will cause into our businesses. An example, if you are in cosmetic manufacturing and you have ingredients that you're doing, you're manufacturing your lotions, you have chemicals that could be coming from across the globe. You have maybe natural ingredients that are coming from the local farmers. we need to be aware that if I'm buying my local chemicals from the next door, I need to understand that the local shop next door, because most of our SME, they buy in small bulk. So they will buy from a shop that is next door. So it is important for an SME to understand, when I go to the shop next door to buy my chemicals, where does that chemical come from? So that I am prepared to know that my supplier is not necessarily the shop next there, that if there is disruption of what we have talked about, maybe we cannot be able to ship or there's a global disaster, then it is most likely that our supply will also be affected. That way, then we are able to understand, how do I plan my supply value chain? Do I need to look for alternative suppliers? And for you to look for alternative supplier, you also need to understand, can my product use alternative raw materials? How can I align my team to be able to locally source the alternative or to adapt to usability of different raw material if the preference of the raw material that we require is not available? I would say, like, we do packaging, and most of the SMEs are buying packagings from us, but they need to understand that for me to produce for them packaging, I'm importing my raw material from maybe from China, from India, from across there. So if there is a disruption across the importation, then it is most likely that they will also be affected, and they need to be prepared for this, that if tomorrow they come to Mary and Mary is not able to give them the solution of the packaging, what would be the alternative that they can be able what is the alternative that they can use? If there's completely no availability of that, what alternative can they use? In processes, it is important also to understand the processes of your production, so that you're able to understand, if my process of production takes maybe 1 day, and my supply demand or my customers' demand is required, my production for today can only supply or sustain my customers for 2 days. It is then important to understand that if today I have maybe a unique disaster that has only affected me and not affected the whole market, am I capable to supply or to sustain my customers that I'm supplying, so that they do not look for alternative for the next 1 week? Then you're able to look in it and think, do I need to, in my planning, have buffer stock so that I will not be affecting my supplier if something unique happens to me? I would then also say that it's also important to understand, like we have seen with COVID, when COVID happened and everybody was affected, and I saw quite a number of SMEs who were able to quickly change. Like maybe if they were tailors, they were quickly able to change from what they were manufacturing to manufacture, like in Kenya, priority of mask, because this is what the client was requiring at that particular time. It is then important to know how quick can I be able to change my processes to produce what the client is demanding now. And if you don't pre-analyze some of these issues, then you would not be able to see the opportunities that are created with the disaster. Our keynote speaker today said that it's important also to understand the priorities or the benefits of an SME. As an SME, it's very easy for you to make a decision to turn around, and this is an advantage for SMEs that maybe multinationals are not able to do that. So it is important for us to look at, what are my competitive advantages that most likely the multinationals will not have that. I would give an example, like in my company, we have, in my group of companies, we have one company that manufactures cosmetics and the cleaning detergents. And when COVID came, we were quickly able to turn around and manufacture sanitizer. So our quick making of decision, looking for and knowing where we could be able to ask for help and support, we were quickly able to convert our production from the normal detergent and adapt to the production of what was required through the COVID. It is also important to understand that if there is a disruption today, how will that directly affect your product? Example I give again, we produce in our packaging, we produce water bottles, and all of a sudden, the restaurants were not operating. If we were not aware that the restaurants are not operating and they are the consumers of our water bottle, then we would be saying that there's no business but we are not connecting it with the requirement or the demand that, or the market that we service. So we were then also quickly able to convert and say, let us stop concentrating on the water bottles and concentrate maybe on other products that are needed now, or minimize our production now so that we're able to mitigate our production cost or meet to the requirements of the COVID that were required, that we operate alternatively or we keep social distance. Understanding our market, we were able to quickly organize ourselves. The other thing that also came in, and I'll give an example of operational logistics. It is important to ask yourself as an SME, what are my operational logistics? In case of a risk, how would that be affected? We saw, like in Kenya, I give an example that we had a curfew that you cannot leave from within your region to the other region. We also had curfew that you cannot operate 24 hours, operate from this time to this time. And this really affected our logistical operation because our customers are outside Nairobi. So it was a big challenge to even think, how do we mitigate that? We had never thought that it would come a time that we cannot, our cars cannot be able to move from the next town. We did not have a digital platform. So it had not been necessary for us to invest on an e-commerce, but we were quickly able to get into an e-commerce platform so that our customer across the region or across the town, they were able to access our products through the e-commerce. So it is important to understand, if there's a disaster today, how does that affect your operational logistics, and how quickly can you be able to change and adapt to mitigate that? Then again, with the customer priority, the change of the customer behavior in buying. If maybe there's a disaster and your product is not a priority need for the customer, what are you supposed to do? Because if there's financial crisis, people change the priority of the product that they buy. So is the product one of them? And how do you mitigate that? How do you make sure that you balance in your production or in your product, you diversify, so that if maybe this industry has a problem, you can be able to back up your finances or your production through maybe another industry? Those are some of the questions that I think as SME we need to understand. And mostly what I'm saying is, you need to understand your product, you need to understand your processes, you need to understand your market, and ask yourself those what if questions. What if tomorrow this industry, I had Joseph talk about the ban of plastic bags. I produce plastics. And one of the problems that we got when there was the ban of plastic ban, and right now we are talking of ban of plastic packaging, which is necessary for us to take care of our environmental need. We are busy looking at what do we do to mitigate that. And in my company, I would say, like, we have an initiative that we call Takataka ni Mali. And what we are doing is to try to change the mentality that our plastic is not going to the environment. How can we repurpose that? How can we use it as a resource, not just for us, but also to help the people, to make them understand how they can sort and separate that waste, sell it to people who would recycle it and use it as a product, because it's not as raw material, because it's not everybody who would recycle it, but everybody can be able to collect the plastics and sell it to a recycler who needs that plastic as a raw material. We have also invested in a digital tool in our organization to map our supply chain, so that if tomorrow I am making my natural products and I'm getting maybe my avocado oil from Muranga, or I'm getting my shea butter from Uganda, and there's a disaster like what you're talking about, locust, that things didn't happen, then I clearly know, or I can be able to anticipate, that my process or my production cost may go high because price may increase if there's scarcity of raw material, or it is most likely that I need to start thinking, where would my alternative supply, where would I be looking to buy if I don't get my supplies from the normal place where it is that I supply? Then the other thing that I would also talk about is how do you relate with your people? Remember, I'm a business owner, but I have people who are working for me. And through COVID disaster, as I'm thinking about my business, they are also going through emotional and family disasters. How do I make sure that I'm able to balance these so that I am not just thinking about how can I be able to salvage my business? I also have that human face of knowing that as much as maybe I'll let them go, I need them tomorrow. It is not my wish, and it is also not your wish to go. And I also need to understand that even those who are working for me, if they are not able to meet their need, then they cannot be productive. I'll give an example. When COVID came, I have about 300 employees. And out of our 300 employees, 100 of them are casuals. And we had to let go these casuals. I think it was a disaster in itself that even my team saw that we had to let 100 people go. And some of the things that we did was to make sure that even if they were not working for us, we made sure that they had food. They had food as they could not continue. So myself and my team, we used to buy and support them with food. But now things are opening up and we have been able to have quite a number of them coming back. So the other thing I'll talk about is your client. In terms of when you have crisis, it's most likely that you will affect also the operation. So it is important to think, if this is my client and I want to maintain them, what are those mitigation measures that I would put that as I am affected by this disaster, I'm able to minimize the repercussions that it to my client. I give an example. If I'm running a restaurant today and maybe I get France, or maybe I get fire in my restaurant, and maybe I'm contracted by different organization or by different schools that I supply their lunch. And this has happened to me today. It is important for me to quickly think, how do I make sure that I do not inconvenience the people who are depending for me that particular day? So it is important for me to think, do I outsource that? And if I need to outsource that, how quickly can I be able to turn around on how to outsource, and so that I do not inconvenience the other client? So it's important, as you're looking into mitigating your disaster, understand also your lack of delivery, how it affects your client. So for me, if you ask me, it is mandatory that SMEs have to include disaster and risk management in their day-to-day business learning. It is important that we understand, and not just understand our product. We need to understand the repercussion of not even supplying that product, what it means, not just our operation. We need to understand what would stop our operation, and also when we stop our operation, how do we affect our client? So it is important to think through all that. I think I've given examples of the questions that we need to ask ourselves. All the other panelists have talked to us generally about all the things that we need to do in risk management. I think from a perspective of a manufacturer on the ground, I have talked more on the manufacturing. So let us embrace this. Let us not think that disaster management is for the multinational. Ask ourselves as SME those simple questions that we meet each and every day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miringesho. You bring a smile on my face. Disaster management is not for multinationals. It's for all of us. For us in risk management, we always say that we really need to support SMEs in risk management. It has been an uphill task to support the SMEs, and it's very nice to hear you saying those words. Just to recap some key points from your presentation, I think one of the things you said, and very properly, is in terms of manufacturing, raw material is a very important part of your business. So if you're supplying, who is your supplier? So your supplier, or the person you source from, is part of your risk management journey, and you need to be able to understand, if they don't supply, what is my alternative? if there is a border closure, where do I get these raw materials? This is really risk management in perspective. If I have somebody I'm supplying from China and India, and there is border closure, where is the next alternative that I would get my raw materials? So we actually say that suppliers are part of risk management journey. We need to analyze them. We need to find out how long they take to supply. We also need to find out, are they using ethical practices to bring the materials home, because there are very many laws and regulations, even to do with child labor. There are very many cases around that. That's one key point that you said. You also said understanding your processes, your manufacturing processes. So if you process your products for 1 day and the supply is for 2 days, if there is a disaster, have you done proper stock management? You know, do you know how much you can be able to produce? If you're going to a holiday, how much do you need to produce to be able to cater for that holiday? If there's a disaster, how long is your buffer stock be able to be there? Key point, understanding your processes. The other thing is performing a quick change, agility, like we spoke about. And we said that SMEs are agile. I think our guest speaker also spoke to this, that they're able to make decisions quickly. You said you are doing detergents, and now you're doing sanitizers. Quick turnaround to your production system. So if you're in manufacturing and you have a production system, what are the alternatives in place for you to be able to manufacture another product? I know most of the manufacturing plants are able to produce different things, but most manufacturers only concentrate on what they know. So great point there, Mary. Great point. Then in terms you spoke about you're producing bottles and you had to minimize production because they are not required. Again, understanding your market. What does the market need, and how much are you producing? Are you just producing to keep in the store, or you're producing to sell? Critical point again. And then operational logistics that have COVID has affected. Curfews, people can't travel. So if you are in industrial area and you have people coming from a different place, maybe they're coming from Kiambu, they can't get into your manufacturing space. So what did you do to that? Border closures, time restrictions, which have all affected. And these are part of risk management that you talked about. Great points on operational logistics, and going forward, putting those points across and knowing how they comply to that. And then there's something critical you have said about change of customer needs. During COVID, people have only been buying food products, minimal purchase of other things. And you mentioned the issue of understanding product, market, process, and customer. Key and important. Then you said you have a digital tool that you have invested in to map up your supply chain. Wow, that's a good one right there. I don't know how it operates. I would like to know much more about it, but you spoke about it quite briefly. Then you spoke about relationship of your staff members, which is critical. People are going through emotional issues, family issues, and you said you have supported your members through that. I think those are some of the things that you have said, and you have said it's mandatory to do disaster and risk management and to understand it in SME. Great presentation, Mary. Thank you so much. We'll move on, just to know that we are running out of time. We are going to the last panel's speaker, and we can go to questions and answer and close. So we request that you give us maybe the next maybe 15 minutes to be able to close this. Request 15 minutes to be able to close this. We are going to the next panel. The next panel speaker will be Muthoni Njogu. I read her bio very quickly. Muthoni Njogu has 25 years of national and international experience in the fields of humanitarian relief, operations, partnership, resource mobilization, interagency coordination, and intergovernmental processes. In her previous career, she worked for the United Nations system and held positions in Kenya, Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Indonesia, and Swaziland. She is now a social entrepreneur who is passionate about green economy plans. Muthoni believes in making communities better through empowerment. She founded the Leeds and Mwega Youth Empowerment Group, whose mission is to roll out a sustainable youth empowerment model to scale up job creation and social transformation. The youth group promotes learning and development activities and has recently rolled out an e-learning program for entrepreneurship development. She has an academic background in international relations, management, and organization development. She speaks in English, French, and Swahili. So Modoni will be speaking about actions and commitments from the private and public sectors following the COVID-19 pandemic, what actions they have demonstrated, and the importance of an all society approach to addressing risk. And the question she'll be addressing is how, in your view, will this shared responsibility contribute to resilience building in the SME sector? Mudhoni, please take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry about that. Thank you, Caroline, and I acknowledge all the speakers who spoke before I did. I would like to thank IIA for the opportunity to contribute to this particularly important dialogue on understanding disaster risk, a dialogue that comes at a time when SMEs and other sectors are dealing with the impact of COVID-19 on our lives and livelihoods. My reflections are largely informed by what we witnessed as a country following the reporting of the first COVID-19 case in Kenya. In the aftermath, we observed a huge interest of financing in different sectors to cushion lives and livelihoods. An economic stimulus package was included in the discussion, including seed capital to help push on SMEs. And these, of course, are initiatives that are predominant practice of financing recovery post-disaster. I believe that our lessons learned from the pandemic point towards the importance of risk management programs that address mitigation and risk reduction strategies. There is a need to increase risk literacy, to improve risk visibility, and to educate vulnerable populations for the disaster management focus from response and recovery to mitigation, risk reduction, and prevention to minimize the impact of disaster. The public sector, I believe, should work towards implementing risk management frameworks that focus on education, risk prevention, preparedness, and also work towards enacting laws that allow greater capital to disaster risk and mitigation strategies. Finally, the private sector, on the other hand, has needed capabilities, including financing, risk information, risk assessment, and catastrophe modeling expertise. And this is really the discussion, is to bring through all society approach to understanding risk, and to really drill in the fact that disaster risk management needs to be based on an understanding of disaster risk in all its dimensions of vulnerability, capacity, exposure of persons and assets, hazards, and the environment. I believe that IIA, through this dialogue and the subsequent series, will result in the development of a sustainable roadmap towards building the resilience of SMEs. Thank you very much, and over to you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Muthoni. I think you have very ably summarized our discussions on some of the interventions for the public and private sector. I think I should not go through that. That was very straightforward and very well summarized. I think we'll move to the next session. The next session is a question and answer session. It will be facilitated by Sarah. I will read her bio very briefly. She has a very long one. I'll read very briefly her bio. So Sarah is a senior consultant with 25 years experience, expertise in international and entrepreneur development. As a founder and principal for MarketWorks Global, she guides startups, small and medium growing businesses, social enterprises, and other entities in pursuing social motivated sustainability development goals through revised business strategies, partnerships, and fundraising. She has sound experience in consulting with multinational and bilateral donors, national and regional governments, academia, and philanthropic foundations, international NGOs in Latin America, Caribbean, the UK, Africa, and Australia. Welcome, Sarah, to moderate the question and answer session. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you. I think we'll be quite brief. We had a rich inflow of questions, and that's nice to see that many of you are really taking note and really grasping hold of the layered impacts that disasters have, even if they don't specifically affect your sector, for instance, locusts and flooding, but you find that the trickle-down impact, as Mary has described, into other services and products and sectors is really evident. And I think many of you are beginning to take note from the evidence of the questions. Some of the questions we'll put to session 2 because they were around financing. I'll give you an example. How can we enhance the role of financial institutions such as banks to boost risk management for SMEs? Now, that question we'll leave for session 2 and maybe to our colleagues in DFC to go over that. Some key questions for other questions included learning, tools, and know-how. So it means that based on what we've heard from Caroline and Mary, especially, SMEs are beginning to sit up and ask, what do we need to learn and what are the tools out there and who do we go to seek help? So again, this is something that we will put into a report later to send back to you with the answers, the directions, and also maybe even a directory of how to access the tools that are available from the different partners at the moment, so that at least many of the SMEs can start to explore their own issues and find resources. So the key questions, there are a few, but I think we'll only touch on 2. How can large corporates and multinationals support this resilient space? So we've heard it from Mathoni about the all society approach. So how can corporates and multinationals support a resilient space? I think we can put that to Iman Kennelly.
Yes, I'll take that. So I think it goes back to what we were discussing about how larger size entities are sometimes better positioned to take risks and absorb risks from SMEs. And I think if you look at corporates, the previous panelist was talking about looking at supply chains, SME supply chains. But if you look at corporate supply chain, larger corporate supply chains, they rely on SMEs and smaller producers in a lot of cases. So it's in the larger corporate's best interest that the smaller SME company mitigate their risk so that the larger company supply chain is not interrupted. So there's definitely a financial interest in larger corporates to take a position, take a stake in helping to cover some of the costs that are related to making SMEs more resilient that are in their supply chain. And then also perhaps to contract on a basis with SMEs where the corporate is bearing some of the disaster risk in the relationship between the two entities. And one way to do so is to price the transaction between the two entities so that it takes into account some of the disaster risks that is going to be shared between the two entities. So perhaps the larger corporate gets preferred pricing, better pricing from the SME based on the corporate's willingness to absorb and take some of that longer term disaster risk.
Right, thank you. Another question, I'll go straight into it, is how do we incorporate disaster risk and resilience into the company's business continuity manual? So we heard about business planning, and I think this is I think Michael is off actually, so I'm wondering if we can put this to Mary. How do we start to do that? How do we incorporate it into the business continuity manual? I know you spoke of agility and being able to have a business model that actually demonstrates agility. So how would a company that doesn't have this start to change their business model and develop a business continuity plan? So to Mary.
Thank you. I'll say I think part of the training that the Invest in Africa has done has given us some tools that we can be able to do that. And it's a very simple tool of simply just asking those questions that I was asking about and having an answer. It is simply sitting with your team, because an SME cannot be able to do this alone. You need to sit with your team and you go process by process, department by department, and you understand if maybe an example, if it is your IT department and you're talking about, we talked about fraud, IT fraud and all that. If today I get an IT fraud, how can I respond to that? if today maybe our computers we got a virus that erased all our data, do we have backups? Do we have access to those backups? How quickly can I be able to restore our operation? So it's about critically understanding your process, and you go step by step in each stage of your process and ask those questions. What if this happens? If it is a machine that maybe I say that you got fronts, or maybe there was fire or there was electrical that happened and you cannot be able to operate, how do you immediately come out from that? And by the time you're growing yourself to come out from that, what are the alternatives that you can be working with? How quickly can you fix for you to be able to run? If it's a disaster that is affecting not only you and it is affecting maybe a national disaster, or is you need to understand how does that repercussion trickle down to you? So it's about being aware and asking yourself simple question, even without the tools. If today I am buying from here and I cannot access that, what is my alternative? I think that is a risk management that we are talking. It is assessment. You categorize your risk, understand what are the priorities, what are high priorities, what are low priority. Understand also what you can avoid, because there are risks that you can avoid. You can say that if this area is prone to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then I'm not gonna get into that. So you're avoiding the risk. So it is understanding your risk, you categorize your risk, and then come up with, if that happens, how do I mitigate, or how do I address that?
Thank you. Thanks, Mary.
Sarah?
Yes, you're on.
Yeah, I'd like to add to what Mary just said.
Right. Michael, this is Michael. Okay.
Yeah, in terms of the mitigation, I think what Mary was referring to essentially is what we call a business impact analysis, which you would review the business by segments and try to identify the most critical functions that is required to meet your client needs. And then once you identify those services, then you move towards developing a strategy that will assist you in that process, which would include your staffing requirements, because recognizing that you may need to operate on a minimal level. So you need to identify the minimum requirements you need, both in terms of the resources and the most critical services that has to be delivered to your clients.
Great. Thank you. I'm glad you came back on. Thank you very much for that. Caroline, just some housekeeping. Do we have time for one more question? I know it's almost 4:30.
Yes,
What do you
it's
say?
4:30. I don't know if there are any more questions. Maybe we can take 2 more last questions, and then maybe the next we can queue them for later to deal with them later.
Right. Okay. So, question: what strategic investments and incentives could encourage SMEs? And I think this is related to Iman's question. Encourage SMEs to prioritize risk management as good business practice. So, what investments can we give them, and what incentives can we give them to encourage them? Especially given that many of them have said they're seeking funding, they can't do this alone, and they certainly don't have the money to pivot at this point. What investments can we give them, and what incentives? Now, I think if we can have 2 people answering this question, if we can have Joseph, and if we can have Iman answering this question.
Yeah, so I'll offer one example. I think that a lot of times, if we're not representing SMEs, so the institutions that are involved in the space, really look at coming up with different products that are separate products, separate solutions for SMEs, whereas in a lot of cases, SMEs would benefit from integrated solutions. So that would be using financial products, credit, even tangible products that can just be added onto. So we can add some of these resiliency either tools or risk mitigant tools to products that they need to run their business. An example is there's a program which is run by the Africa Insurance Company involving livestock insurance and climate risk insurance. And that product is provided as an integrated suite of products, which includes micro insurance, but also it includes savings products and credit. So it's basically an add-on to a credit product that these producers would need, even if they were not so concerned with addressing disaster risk.
Thank you. Joseph, and any ideas what incentives could be used to encourage SMEs to prioritize risk management as good business practice?
Well, I'll speak from the environment perspective. One thing that we try to encourage as MEDA is we try to support SMEs to develop environmental action plans so that they can be able to identify these risks regarding in various thematic areas of the environment so that they can be able to plan ahead. And this is, from this, we've been able to try to recommend SMEs that are supporting in terms of including or having that mindset of having an environmental person doing or contributing to the budget preparations, because we know that not everybody can be able to get finances, maybe due to credit scores, any other factor. And I think the best way we can be able to build on SMEs preparedness is if we can be able to have them using what they have right now and see ways we can be able to improve on that. So right now, I know there's ways of doing sustainable finance in businesses, and I think it will be a very good tool if SMEs can be able to adopt that technique in terms of trying to find cash flows within their current finances so that they can be able to invest back in terms of being prepared in the future. Thank you.
Caroline, shall we stop there and go back to you? And I will put the rest in the document. There's a couple of questions here, and we'll put it into the relevant sections. And we will also liaise with the panel afterwards at some point so that we can actually get their input into some of these Q&As and send it back to you in a full report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, thank you very much. Everybody, we are going to the next session. The next session is a wrap-up session. It will be done by Dennis Okore. He's a stakeholder engagement manager at Invest in Africa. Welcome, Dennis Okore.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for that wonderful moderation since we began. Indeed, this has been a wonderful session. And personally, I've been intrigued by the insights that have been able to come up from session today. Mine is very coming towards the end of the session and more like an icing to the cake. So I will just say that the session today has been very engaging, and thank you for the wonderful work that has been done by the moderators, Caroline Gadi and Sarah Adamako, to bring out the issues from the participants and to guide the conversation to us understanding the risk and disaster, and more importantly, draw a line between how risk and disaster fits into the economic side of things and how it impacts the business, and how this can be managed, as we have learned today from our first speaker, that these are elements that we continue will appear in our lives, and not only in business, but we need to manage them. And I also liked the aspect that was brought by through the panel conversations about drawing a linkage between the profit, people, and the planet, and looking at the intersection around this. More importantly, I would like to pay a special tribute to our guest speaker for setting the tone for today. Margareta Wahingstone, we thank you for making time to be with us and for that wonderful opening remarks that sets a tone for this series going forward. I also want to pay special tribute to the other panelists led by Iman Tariq. That was very good presentation. Mary Ngechu gave us a very good understanding from a personal experience as someone who is in manufacturing and giving us what are the things that they have experienced, and more importantly, how we look at risk beyond ourselves. That was quite very good. And Michael Vincent took us through a deep dive on just looking at the tenets of risk and the intersection, and Mary and Donny also came out very strongly in a very spot on way just to give us an insight of other perspectives, having worked with the community and also borrowing from her international and national experience. So it's been a wonderful session. Today we were joined by other stakeholders, not only from the SME side, we had other stakeholders from the ENGOs like Red Cross. We joined from other stakeholders from the bilateral and multinational organizations like the UNHCR, and even our partners like Safaricom were in attendance. So thank you very much, everyone, for making this a success, and even the part of Invest in Africa team who have been part behind the scenes trying to put this together. What I'd like to tell you that this is just the beginning of the first the network of series that we are coming up with, and stay tuned. And this is a journey that will take us towards eventually having a clear framework that we can use to help secure our businesses, our SMEs, and more importantly, even support other actors in the private and the public sector be able to come up with a structured way that the interventions can be run. So stay put. We'll be having our next series towards the end of the month. Then the third series for this year sometime in November, and we'll be communicating this. I encourage you to look out at our social media feeds, look at us on Facebook, look at us at LinkedIn, as well as on YouTube. This session today has been recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube in the coming hours. And I'll just end by saying that we are continuing with this conversation. Our lines are open. Engage with us in through our emails, and let us get feedback on other issues and even your perspectives based on what we've learned today. Thank you very much, and have a good week ahead as the week comes to an end. Thank you.